words that the words are referencing, and that meaning that the words don't necessarily prove by their very existence what they are describing. So that's the Buddhist position, and yet the claim or the point is made that we want to hold that the Buddha is a spiritual authority, and therefore his speech is unerring, and we can trust it as being valid in relation to the subject matter that it's saying. So how can you?
So specifically in the reverse progression, we start with proving that the teachings are flawless. So is there then a way to prove that the teachings are flawless as a means to prove that the teachings are flawless?
So I figured what she said. I don't know.
No, at the digital to data, checking that one message, checking China, checking you like checking China, checking you like but the didn't wish you the didn't checking Tarva. Yeah, and combating on the 2 years, Chivatatilla, Chidan Chijig Tarva, then combating on the 2 years in a way. Tati Chivan and Shinten, combating on the 2 years, Chivat the Chijig Tatilla, then combating on the Chuti Tobichi. In the tree, talking away, should never in the just to choosing tragedy. But choosing tragedy, converting on the tree, I say, shoot liberty and joy into the joy and my choosing tragedy, the day is converting on the tree. Talk at the younger one. Chidani, that choosing tragedy, choosing to joy. Chidam, I did letting not doing any thought the Java. So to the soon TV, soon tell it then on the Tangible to be ever. The current Tangas soon tell it then, soon the Jajati came ever told to talk at them by Gyumed. Soon the Javatar Turner go into Ninti Chamani to be ever. Then it did Toya, did church at the time, Joya. I Metabotanic chair. But yeah, pure metabolic is less than metabolic image. Metabolic Nangalesic is Lavina. Metabolic Jubilee Nangality Metabolic Jubilee. That can Nangal Metabolic is mean to buy energy for Chuba. Nangal Metabasigia is Lavina. Metabachia, Chippy Metabachia. They think they Metabatoy. That is the Pungalete, Punga Metabaris. 메타바 주니에티게 군도 메타바도 이 군도 메타바에서는 지금의 군도 메타바도 이야기 지금의 군도 메타바에 소리야 소치 얘기 가사디 군도 메타바도 이야기 나도 똑같이 받잖아 어디는 군도 메타바도 소리야 Gyumed metafasile pisitaji nilapsena kawale chile kawati metafasile kawale sige sapsena niko metafasile jurba bata kawani chibes resha chasi ni kawai chapsena chujurba ati sine ati chitati metafasile piama
Sure. You want to explain that?
That's what I love.
Basically, start out by saying that the Buddhist position is that generally what words assert does not serve to prove the content of what they're saying. My understanding is that this falls into the area of what is known as testimony, whether words that are spoken in certain ways, whether it's spiritual literature or whether it's spoken by someone who could or could not be considered as knowledgeable about a particular subject, whether or not that speech, based on the source of the speech, who asserted the speech, is that sufficient to believe what the speech is saying. And the Buddhists basically say that that's never, the only in-person speech that has that quality is the speech of a Buddha. And the only reason that we can claim that is because we can establish that the Buddha is an authority, a flawless speaker, about, particularly, not just about anything, but particularly about spiritual subjects. And if and when we establish that, then we can trust his speech as being flawless. And the reverse is true as well. We can examine his speech for ourselves, in particular speech about subjects that are not directly evident in experience, but particularly speech about the nature of things that are not evident, such as impermanence and suffering and selflessness. And we can, through our own reasoning, we can determine that that speech, which is unique in the sense that only the Buddha taught that subject matter, we can verify its extraordinariness and its truthfulness. And from that, and that was your question, was how can we then determine that the nature of the speaker is without error. And so that's sort of the unique subject matter that this chapter is about. But generally, as Rinpoche said, if someone makes certain assertions, the assertion itself does not carry the weight of being capable of proving the existence of what's being asserted. So just because someone says there's water in that building over there, there's no connection between the purported water and the statement that says that the water is there. There's nothing about that speech that we can rely upon to know that in fact there is water or not. And then Rinpoche gave another example where he was talking about even the speech about impermanence, that even though generally impermanence is true of certain things, things positively produce things, that if the person who utters them is not really knowledgeable about the speech that he's using, even if it's true, then another instance of a case where even truthful speech is not something that, in and of itself, can be relied upon as to what it's saying. That he made some further points about that. When we're talking about speech in terms of the Dharma, then we're talking about there is the Dharma that is expressed in the form of words, but those words have meanings. And so then another aspect of the Dharma is if you investigate those words and you gain some understanding of those words, and that's the aspect of the Dharma that's known as the cognitional form of the Dharma. So that's one of the distinctions that is important in answering the question that the person made about what's unique about the Buddha's teaching and how we can investigate that and infer from that the Buddha is an enlightened. There is a statement in Geshe-la's commentary, which is kind of a summary of the Buddhist position on the arguments for the existence of past lives and future lives. And so, summary of the argument for past lives is that it says Hamelva means an ordinary person, an ordinary samsaric person, who has just been born and who possesses a mind. Then that person who has just been born, his or her mind that they possess at that time must have been preceded by an earlier mind, meaning a mind prior to his or her birth. You can think of birth as the moment of conception, in the absolute sense. And it says the reason that you can infer that, or the reason that you can know that to be true, is because it is a mind. And so that's the argument. That seems, so the point is that mind is something that is an impermanent or something that arises, is a causally produced thing, and it must be produced by something which is similar in nature. The material cause for the mind must also be mental in nature. So whatever that first moment of that mind is, it must have derived from an earlier moment of the continuum of that consciousness. That earlier moment had to have been prior to this life, and hence there must have been an earlier existence of the person who was just born. So that's the argument for the past life. And then the summary of the argument for future lives is slightly different in that it says the mind of a person who is on the verge of dying, who is about to die. So it means a person at the end of life, who is at the final moment of their existence. Their mind, it says, must be reborn. In some means must take birth. This means that's what an ordinary person means. That a samsaric person must become reborn, and therefore must give rise to a future mind of his or her continuum. Why? Because that mind of that ordinary person at the final moment of their death is a mind that is still under the influence of attachment. That's key. And so that argument has to be unpacked. But the argument is that a mind that is still under the influence of desire must, at the end following that life, be then followed by, or there must come about another moment of consciousness. So that's the essence of the argument for a future life. So between these two arguments, the latter argument, the argument for future lives, for the existence of future lives, is unique in that the prior argument, the argument for past lives, said that simply the fact that a person has a consciousness in this life, that's sufficient to argue that it must have been preceded by a mind of a similar nature and was part of the same continuum of that person. But in general, you can't argue that the mind that exists at the final moment of this life, just because of the mind, necessarily will be followed by a subsequent moment of consciousness following this life. So the key word, there are two elements in that argument. One is that uses the word samjor. Samjor is the Tibet or the Buddhist term for conception, samsaric conception in particular. It means to be joined to a future life. And it refers to the moment at which a person's consciousness takes birth in the mother's womb, in the case of a mammal. So that's the moment of conception. And that moment of conception is understood as being a form of samsaric rebirth. So, for instance, you would not say for an arahat. So an arahat, by definition, is someone who has abandoned all the mental afflictions and attachment in particular. So the final moment of an arahat's consciousness in his or her life, when an arahat passes away, then the arahat is not subject to the union in the sense of conception with a samsaric rebirth, because they don't have the cause of the mental affliction that would force or which would require a new consciousness in a subsequent rebirth to occur. So that's part of the essential force of that argument. And so the fact that it's a mind that is still subject to desire, the key to that is to say that that's sufficient to prove that the final moment of consciousness will be followed by a subsequent moment of samsaric consciousness. That's an interesting claim that has to be properly investigated. Another point that sort of surrounds this whole issue is, well, what happens to this is the larger question, what happens to an arahat's consciousness when he or she, his or her life comes to an end? So there are some Buddhist schools who hold that the consciousness, the continuum ceases, and the arahat ceases to exist in a sense. And that's Gyumed. Gyumed means the continuum. Che means it stops. So other schools will say the arahat's mind continuum doesn't cease, but nevertheless, he or she is not subject to a samsaric form of conception and rebirth. That's a larger issue, but it's relevant to the discussion.
Gyumed SMD Rinpoche 참 주의해야 되겠지만 그래서 Gyumed SMD 상기리 남들 반대 Gyumed 20 누구를 봐 Rinpoche 참 좋아해야 Rinpoche 나한테 Gyumed 참 좋아 Gyumed 유지 Rinpoche teaching Papa is Gyumed Milam Gyumed any Gyumed Sunday Gyumed 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 Singira 참 잘 보인다. Gyumed Singira Gyumed Singira 아주 생각난 것이 지키는 생수가 어디에 리버치만 참 좋아해 리버 주책 말했어. 나 지금 산지가 산.
So there are different schools. There are different views of so-called So there's the one Mahayana school which said there's really ultimately only one vehicle, and that is the Buddha's path to enlightenment, which can be reached in different ways. One way being that one reaches the end of the Hinayana path, becomes an arahat, passes away, enters into what's called the nirvana without remainder, but his or her consciousness does not cease, as other schools maintain. So this one vehicle doctrine states that what happens is that the Arhat's mind, following his or her death, is, we can say, joined to a subsequent consciousness. It's not joined to a samsaric rebirth. So that consciousness enters into kind of a state of peaceful nirvana, which is kind of almost like a dormant state for a long period of time, and then at some point the Buddhas will, quote, awaken them, and then even those arahats will have to generate bodhicitta and then continue on to the path, on the path to ultimate enlightenment. So that view, which is the one that is generally held to be true, is that even the mind continuum of an arahat doesn't end following his or her death. It continues to exist.
Tadine, Juanku Soja to Ninjutis. Tati Chanti Kajila Patangarba, Yeluti, the Rinpoche de Jabayina, Juankunga, Mashierba, Juankanga, and Sojachin, Kagris, River. Deti Dietilla, Dola Soba, Hongota, Loited, and Luban Leva, Gracie, Soja to Minjuru, Shina, that Juan Soja, Signaris, or Hecit. Juan Tanja Soja, starting the tiny chain, Terra, Didi, Juan Soja to Minjutis, nature. Dollars of the Ombudsman, Loki, River, we have a Peshiaris. Since Roger James Tigmaris, starting with Tani, Jane, and Karsuri. Dollars of the Ombudsman, Loki, River, never Peshi, soldiers, because Chenas, that is the reality. China, green Peshi, the Kevina. Yeluti, Lukashi, Kevina, and Juan suggest Tigris. Tatikaji, Juan suggest Tigmari. Allah so that the Peshida on the town, never killing the women yet today at least. On Gotan, Tola Soba, Tola Soba, and Gotan, located in the women of Peshida. Peshida suggests Tigmari.
So we started by saying that the materialists claim that it's not possible to cultivate compassion for as long as it takes to become enlightened because there's no past and future life. Then we had the verse that was talked about just at the end of the morning class, which is the main position, Buddhist position, which is to say that certain elements of living beings cannot arise exclusively from physical matter. Right? So then the next point is that the Buddhists will kind of attack the materialist view. So the materialists, even though the materialists maintain that mind is a derivative of matter, either it's a quality of matter, or it's essentially matter, or it's related in an essential way to matter, that's their position. So the Buddhists say, well, okay, then how do you determine when life, things that we want to call life, even if their ultimate nature is that they're material living beings, or that their minds are explainable in terms of their physical bodies. So how do you distinguish between the source from which living beings can arise and the physical matter which don't have the ability to generate living beings. So it starts out by presenting the materialist point of view, which is materialists will claim, yes, not all physical matter is the source of what we want to call animate life. So stones and so on don't have the capacity to generate living beings. They don't arise. So there are different kinds of matter. But then the Buddhists will say, well, how do you determine what sort of physical matter does have the capacity to produce life, what we call life, even in this materialistic way of view, versus the kind of matter that doesn't or is incapable of producing animate life. And so the Buddhists will argue, you don't have any way to differentiate what kind of physical matter is capable of doing that. And so then the unwanted consequence follows is that in any physical place, some kind of animal life should be, according to your view, capable of sort of springing into being.
That in yes, Ranuki. Joatamje Soja Sabu Tanijen Tan Juan Kangolo, Jumash Kangolos, Soja Sabu Taniji Batas, Ibata, Ne Kando, Chesela Tobe, Chesele Joyera, Roge Jo, Sile Joyari, Chesela Toba, the Soja Sabu Taniji, Kando, Chesela Kewala Sopa, Kewala Mugu, Sasso, you may chat the Kayam Medici. Chranchena,
So
Soja, Jibby, Lujebatam the Chip, and he shake to us. Lujebatam Jabina, Tasso to reach up in the Soja to Chip, Soja make it Tajo the Yamaris, Tajo Kinichi. Should have been as what I do in the 30 and Chrangi for that sincerity. We made it over doing unity, thinking unity, one by she Javina, but any protections gave each other. That is, the Charang Samutai, if you want to so that is Penny, so that whichever is on, it is so that the unit Tanichi is unit Tanichi is 70 unit Tanichi is 30. That the sound year was dinner, so that year, so that the TVs. Number Shibati. You want us to go to the Jenny Kigia, 50 years, next year. Just you want Tamje, Soja is stopping the Nijin, Ibatas stopping with the Nijin, Soja, you want Tamje stopping, Soja is stopping Marba. That I need to be good. Can't do the you will give me to start to chat and science. I am going to check. Sajo dinner, so that you might see such high yamas. Sajo dinner, so that you might see Yamarva. Never isn't it to the soldier, Kalasa, Sasso, and the soldier, so Jake. Number she will give us up in the start. The Charangi is the art generation. Sasso, if you want that day, Soja give it to us here. Just Soja is happy and is in and he does. If you want to Soja, Soji, but Soja, but. So the way the Soja is happy. Soja is happy with letting Soja use. Chulatin is Soja reality, should be Soja is happy Marva. 天地之間の違いは、今までだってですけど、
So this argument is, someone pointed out that the different versions of the root text that people have, so the wording, or the numbering rather, of the verses is not all the same. So sometimes I've said, we were talking about verse so-and-so, number so-and-so, and it doesn't match the version you have. Apologize for that. So the best thing that I can say is if the number is given, then look a couple of versions on before or after, and you should be able to find it. But there are different versions of the root text that are available, and I cannot account for the difference in the numbers. So I apologize for that. At any rate, we're talking about what my version suggests would be verse 40, which is in the Enlightenment Possible book is verse 38, and I think the version that is only the English, it may actually be verse 40. So that's the verse that we're talking about right now, which is kind of expressing this Buddhist kind of counter argument against the materialist position. And so it says, and it gets up this text, it says, the Buddha says, even though you, materialists, you want to claim, as ordinary observation shows, that even though we want to say, we materialists want to say that the mind is a derivative of matter, we don't want to say that mental things should therefore be able to appear just by virtue of the presence of physical matter. That there are certain kinds of physical matter that give rise to life, and certain kinds of physical matter where we wouldn't think it's possible for life to occur, and that's the sort of common sense observation. But your position does not allow you to be able to give some definitive reason for that difference. And so the Buddhists say, if your view is true, you cannot account for the criticism that it says Juan Tamche. Juan Tamche means every form of the physical elements, the four elements in the classical world, where earth, the four elements of earth, water, fire, and air. Wherever they are present, then that physical matter, whatever form it takes, should have this potential, should possess the seeds for generating life. And according to the materialist position, you cannot disprove that. You cannot give any reason why that wouldn't be the case. And so then in this verse, it uses a phrase. In Buddhist literature, there are four kinds of birth states. There is birth from an egg, there's birth from a womb, there's what's called spontaneous or sometimes miraculous birth, and then there's a form of birth which is described as birth from warmth and moisture. And that birth from warmth and moisture doesn't mean that literally heat and water generate life. It generally means it's beings that are born seasonally during the wet season in India, and when it has to be warm enough, and then you have mosquitoes and insects and things that arise in that time. And so that's a term, drosherekyo. However, the Buddhists are not saying that those forms of life arise out of the water and the warmth. It's just a term for a certain class of beings. So then that term is what's appearing in this verse 40. And it says, while we use that term, we Buddhists use that term, we only think of the warmth and the moisture as a a cooperating or an efficient cause, or something that promotes the arising of life, certain kinds of life in those conditions. We don't mean that the life actually is generated by water and heat. On the other hand, for you have no way of denying or refuting or showing why it's not possible for living things that says sacho, means that you cannot point to a place and give a valid reason why life could not spring from that locus, from that physical location and the physical matter present there. Because according to you, physical matter contains the seed or the potential out of which something mental can manifest itself. So even inanimate physical matter could somehow produce living beings, according to you. And that's what the Buddhist argues against the material. Sorry, I'm just trying to give clarity to the argument.
That could be anything you want. If you want to tell you, could give you some money. Geneti Shevat Guanaris, Sojati. You want by she is Lavina, or something to the Shiva with any Sojato Yarba, Pujiva Yaram Pujaya Yarba, Shadows. Shayarba, Shadow condition to that. I thought you said yes, Sojati, but I'm going to Sojati, I didn't call it any. Sojati or Yarba. Plus, I did speciality, and it's called France, Sojati. But I saw Mexico, but I'm going to just sleep in my bath. So
for instance, this notion of warmth and moisture being a condition for the arising of certain kind of creatures, but we don't see actually the source of where those organisms arise. Maybe their eggs are too small or whatever. We just see that some kinds of insects rise. A similar example is if you take a piece of raw meat or something and leave it out exposed, maybe a fly lands on it. We don't see the fly landing on it. Lays eggs. We don't see those eggs, and all of a sudden maggots appear. So, is it the case that you want to claim that the maggots actually, the source of the maggots is the meat? Is the meat this inanimate physical matter that produced the living, maggots that are, to be produced or which appear in that flesh? We don't want to say that. But according to your position, that would seem to be entirely reasonable. That where those maggots come from? They actually came from a dead piece of meat, or by the same token, some rock or something could actually produce some kind of living creature.
That day, I don't know how to live. Shooting on ever. Shoot down my ship. Shooting on the Tasoja, Gresham, Gold Mouth, Views, not in this Nazo, Sojaki Yerba. The college areas. Taco, you want basically give a yen, but they do not be that should be. She would die. How much would you say? In a quickly, you go out to say about Tadder of the Chineke, Kariche. If you want basically give it that you want. Should be how much was the child. That could be named Soja giving my daughter the care. Give a voyage. Yeah, maybe it's terrible. That's the correct, can't correct any Gyumed. That is one by she the rose, Jason, but the other is Well, detail any good government United States, should be good, some machine. On its gallery. So, in a so that the government is here. You want to see the campaign as we get the big people. How to cheaper is.
Oh,
What it is.
so, and then another kind of different,
Should remember us. Right.
third, which what verse we talking about now? This is
Young. Should remember. Tani. Shaben Handu. Soja. Gomara. Liservatan. Tele Tope. Nedova. Kiva. Mitevata. Juan Tamusi. Juan Tamji to the Kiricher. Juan Tamji to the Kevin Ramen.
so it's not in the root text. In the commentary, it's sort of a different approach to this idea of the unreasonableness of claiming that mind arises from matter. So the argument is, if you prepare water in such a way that it is very clear, Dhamma Chudhamma says that it's, and you use strain it very, very fine strainer, so there shouldn't be any impurities in the water. And then if you leave the water for a certain period of time, it's possible that you would find certain kinds of life would be generated in that water, and they would be of varying types. So the commentary says some things may have red heads, some things may have yellow bodies, for instance. And so how do you account for the fact that the medium, in this case the water, it seems to be very uniform? And so if the physical matter, as according to you, is the source of the animate being, or the mind, then whatever creatures might form in that medium, they all should be the same. And yet we can find that they don't always look the same. Some, they have different appearances. So if they have different forms, but they're formed, but they take birth or they arise in the same medium that has the same consistency to it, then that suggests that the source of those different kinds of beings must be something other than the physical matter where they arise.
That is, maybe Charane Patsungares and Kucha, Yabatiamaris, Kares and Kucha, Lula, Mete Gyumed, Chutamish Tamajina, the Megawatt, Katom Megawatt, Jola Gyumed, Roger Tamje, ladies having Tangi is. Then Yakanga ladies having Tani, so that was the day in which Juma question is giving it to Mati Chigra, and a Kato Drama to
So the argument is that if the physical locus in which beings arise is uniform, then every sentient being that occurs in that particular locus should look exactly the same. And so the fact is, we find that that's not always the case. So then the materialist might argue, well, what answer do you have that will account for that? Or why would your view be any better than ours? And so Jesuit commentary says that our view is that there's nothing inconsistent about the fact that all different kinds of creatures can be found in more or less the same area, because according to our view, all living beings they don't arise from the physical environment exclusively, they're produced by their own karma. And if their karma is different, then their form it's very reasonable that their form could also take on a different aspect.
That is. That is young. Also, Rangi did something. That is Rangi Chevina. Ongola Sobati Rangi Tavameva, you want them to give a chair, Chan Visa. Chan give it to raise together. Tina, Juan Tamni, Koja Gyumed, Soja Tamji, Lake Savage, Tamiji in the seven. Then I cheated Juan Chip, Soja Suru Soja Juata. Also, Rangi Jala, Java Meta, Tamji, Juan Yichel. Shabata, Tuna, Soja, Emity, Piki, Chavan, Edichel. Vanacharaya, Ombule, Gine, Yerutoba, Java, Maivata, Mayinam Sina, Jerry Piano, Bataminia. Ako Kajiti, Chilavia, Charangiluria, Ralulia, Ombule, Gine, Ombula, Gine, Yerutoba, Java, Mayinam Sina, Jerry Piano, Batam, Yang. Doji whichever the mind study really you will attend of the Yadis. In a really you look doji whichever the Maris. Whichever you done caress and uncle a June, you look of a Yarva. On the tenny or Tamu Million. We go on the thing on she on she Johnny, the need you keep it back. And no good to me, you look at China. No good to me, Tambu, Nuzi Mishi. No good to let any. You are let any Nuzi Mishi. Nuzi Mishi go to Nuzi Chichi. The Yuruba. The uncle the Queen Temple. Nothing is not punitive. Inea, one which is Suraba, Inea, beauty, you doji, which are the Maris. So the unity, one could have done by the people done by the Yaris. That is, one could be unity, one could be chasing the Yuruba. You the Muslim let any kick it back. Muslim won't let any to wear back. No one let any. Why should the junior won't let them easy?
So there's a further argument about saying that mind is dependent upon the faculties, and in particular the sense faculty. So in this case, the example is if you have for visual perception, for instance, or if you see some object of the eye that's perceived through the eye consciousness, then through the eye faculty, then an eye consciousness will occur, a sensory eye consciousness, and then subsequent to that sensory eye consciousness, there will be a recollection of having had that sensory perception, right? And so that recollection is purely mental, right? That's an element of the mind. So then the argument is being said, well, don't you hold also that purely mental state, that recollection of the prior sensory awareness, is due to, or is dependent upon, or is Gyumed means through the medium of the faculty. So it's not the physical faculty essential for the arising of that mental state. That almost like saying that something physical is responsible for the mental entity. So that's kind of the materialist arguing back against the Buddhist. But the Buddhist replies, we don't deny that the physical body, and in this case the faculties that are responsible for sensory perception, are instrumental in generating certain kinds of mental states. But what we do deny is that the mental states are completely governed by the physical conditions, even the physical conditions that contribute to their arising, by which is meant that in their absence, then the mental entity would simply disappear. So that the mind is completely dependent on the body in the sense that if the body is taken away, or as in when the body disintegrates, then the mind must also disappear. So the relationship between the mind and body is not that kind. The Buddhist falls back to that position.
Okay. Really, Ombula never showed, never you but Ombula really Matumara Chiaring, Yilula did the rig never Kayama, but Yilula to marriage. That you Ombula Sobati, Gay Charity is the Karesan, something Yangegi, something Yangekan change. To surround the build the metal into that. Some like an age, some like young age, brother, he took the lady Julia, metal in beer. You come out, lady, I can say, send the metal to the school the same day, children. You never yet. You never channel some new rich of him. Got to January. Nanjo to you my young to be ready. You young my young to be ready. Send the other church on the Germany. Got to name the got to you. Need now to be at yeah, for calculating on the teacher. Same with the eye of Shakespeare. You are thinking that. That you let the younger situation and use with the young ya. I think to
So there's a phrase, Lobsang means to reverse, or to, in this case, probably more like to eliminate. To say that the body is a the kind of substratum for the mind. So ten means the basis from which the mind derives. So if the body is the main basis for the mind is utterly dependent on the body, then the phrase is that the mind is something that can eliminate the existence of the mind, and that it is a primary substratum for the mind. Say, that's what the Buddhists are rejecting. that there is a relationship between the body and the mind. Each one can influence the other. But the body is not the basis for the mind in the sense that if it's taken away, then the mind cannot exist. So I believe that's a fair representation of the phrase. It's not a substratum or basis for the mind that is upon which the mind is totally dependent. That's not the case. So an example of that for the Buddhist is that if your sense faculties, which are physical, are damaged, right? You become blind or deaf. So that's something that is damaging to your physical aspect. But the mind itself can remain intact and not have any impairment to it whatsoever. Right? You can think of examples of extraordinary people who were blind and deaf or whatever. On the other hand, if the mind is impaired or the mind becomes subject to some oppressive quality, right? For instance, if you become ill or if you become very upset, that can actually affect you physically. So in that case, the mind can be thought of as being more dominant in the relationship between the mind and the body than the body is in relationship to the mind. That's one point. And another example of that would be, for example, spiritual practitioners, yoginis, who undertake very severe austerities or who live a very austere life. Those individuals, especially as they age, they can become very emaciated and physically look weak. And yet their minds, in fact, can be very highly developed to an extraordinary level in such a way that they're at odds with the condition that their body has taken on. This is another indication of the fact that the mind is not primarily dependent on the body.
No, that 이루 그때 쳐가지 말이 내 때려야 됐어 나 그 뒤에 때려야 됐어 그래서는 그 영화를 때 이루기 뭔가들의 이루기 뭔가들의 원시를 대해서나 원시도 뭔가를 대해서나 영화를 대해서나 제가 뒤에 띵게 이내야 이 도지 비춰가지고 말했어요. 이 가르쳐는 일이 좋아지는 일이 좋고야 말이에요. 다 이들이 이게 도지 비춰가지고 일을 좀 주잖아. 그러나 이게 대부분 약을 주면서 일이 지고래 일이 대부분 대단한 생산부지는 이렇게 생기부는 리얼티 대단히 키워야 돼. 생기부는 리얼 대단히 리얼티가 이것은 이 리얼티 도지고 있어.
So the relationship between the body and the mind is such that each one does have an influence on the other. That's not, Buddhists do not object to that. They accept that. They use the term that the body has sort of more of an indirect influence. Gyumed means not directly, but indirectly they influence your purely mental aspect. So through the sense faculties, and sensory perception arises, and then subsequently the mind itself can be affected by your physical sense, for instance. On the other other hand, the body does not have that sort of governing influence over the mind. But the reverse is true, that the mind can in fact have more of an influence over the body than the other way around. And so, for instance, virtuous states of mind can in fact promote physical well-being. And then, unhealthy states of mind, what we would call unhealthy states of mind, can also have a deleterious effect on your physical well-being.
Just the very language. That one you tell ten Yamari resident or chicken ten Yamari resident Yaris. That the Nami you tell you Naki the ledger. Nami Nami chicken ledger. Ledger to Kinegia. Iruti. Nami Irucherba. Let is also now to be iluti. When I need and now you not let it so to do. I need nam iluti. Nami ilut. Nami ilusiati. Oh, I did that word. That's just an Nami iluti or Jim. Yama. Never reversing the areas. Somewhere there, could or Jimmy, somewhere later, only picking later.
So then one can ask the question, well, is there anything that does have a controlling influence over the mind, in the sense that it can reverse the mind, it can cause the mind to no longer continue to exist in a certain way? And so the Buddhists will say, yes, there is something that can affect the mind in that manner. And so there is there's an element of our being that is our existence that is identified as being due to the ripening of karma. There is an element of our being that exists due to incidental ways in which we live our life. So one is namin. Namarmimba literally means the ripening aspect of our being. So there's a ripening aspect of our mind. So the ripening quality of the aspect of our mind that is the direct result of karma from a prior life is such that its existence is controlled by the karma that produced it. And when that karma, when the power of that karma to maintain that fruitional aspect of the mind is exhausted, then that fruitional aspect of the human mind can no longer remain, and it will disappear. Meaning that human life, that human person's human mind can no longer continue to exist. So karma, that karma can have that kind of controlling over effect over the continued existence of the mind, that portion of the mind that is governed by karma.
Well, that in it, you look over the Ongulas, get a rich. I listen that you receive the cherry, simple decoration, Gashi, and Gashi means so on Pedi which year. In a Pedi which we saw here. But these are really you tend to not use. Nami Viti, or Picare is that. You receive the cherry, and Nami, yes, the nature, the death Nami
So, on the other hand, that aspect of our mind, which is governed by karma, and is a ripening of our karma, is in fact the quality that has influence over our bodies and our faculties. So the karma that is responsible for or has the power to produce the mind, the mental existence of a particular life form, is that mind is responsible for then the development of the corresponding physical body that accompanies that birth state. And so the mind, it's that the mind has more of a control over the nature of the physical body and the senses that accompany that life. So there are different ways of thinking about our life, our existence. There's one element of our existence that is produced by and governed by karma. So there is even a physical element of our being that is related to the karma of a particular birth that we may take. On the other hand, there is an element of our physical being that is not directly produced by our own karma, but rather is derived from our parents. The substance, the semen and egg, that is the source out of which the rough physical body develops. That rough physical body is not necessarily directly tied to the karma that is responsible for certain elements of our physical being, such as our physical faculties. For instance, that verse which started by saying that the breath, the faculties, and the mind are coming from some prior source of a common nature. So this is a distinction that probably most of us are not completely familiar with, but is a distinction that occurs in Abhidharma literature. One is called the aspect of our being, which is a karmic ripening, and then the other one is called Jorwa de Jom. Jorwa de Jom means that some aspect of our physical being that is governed by circumstances in a particular life. So that you might say the nature, right? It's governed by nature as opposed to governed by karma.
개인이 잘 세우게 되지. 그나는 남이 이렇게 찾게 봐. 남이 이렇게 찾게. 시작과 친구 중에 니디 요요지. 한가 친구 중에 한가 친구들이 남의 찾을 봐.
그래.
너 왜?
네,
단로 뒤에 다가 이바다 컴퓨터를 당시 난 발표를 봐.
그래.
이때 접근이 무슨 저때 남이 이렇게 계중 이렇게 발표돼.
네. 원래
원래 시대 표대. 우리가 알류지야 급제스는 지심이
그냥 누가
님들이야. 야리티 또 체육에 취향나. 너 됐다 담을 넣지. 넣으시. 뒤에 다가를 봐. 강거 단대디나 쳤대. 강거 쳤을 때는 지금이나 쳤대. 그러가
So this idea of two aspects of our being, one of them is identified as being governed by karma, and therefore it's a ripening aspect of our being that produced by karma, and then another aspect of our being that is affected by circumstances, what would you say, sort of incidental kind of circumstances in that lifetime. These two aspects of our being are not separable. You can't say, well, there is the part of your physical being that is only affected by incidental circumstances, and then there's somewhere inside you there's a different part of you that is the part that is governed by karma, and these two are existing separately from one another. That's not the case. However, when we are born, if, for instance, depending on our lifestyle, right? So if we have a good diet, or depending on what our diet is, that can affect the condition of our body. Our body can become more healthy or less healthy, depending on those kinds of issues. Those elements of our physical being are not directly related to karma. So there is the karmic ripening aspect of our physical being that is sort of, or to use the phrase that aspect of our being sort of pervades our physical body, but is not affected by incidental conditions such as those. And so this is something that this distinction is something that is addressed in Abhidharma literature. And so as an analogy, Rinpoche said, well, you can have a house, and you build a house, and the house would be something that is, governed by, whatever your resources might be in that, at that particular time. But there's, electricity that is, you have the wiring in the house, and that allows you to illuminate the house. And so you may put an addition onto your house. You may expand your house, but the wiring and the ability to sort of illuminate the house would not fundamentally change. He used that analogy to describe the fact that there are these two aspects to our physical being.
也帮我们对。
Look,
我的弟弟一个人是那里这样的，农业一路的根本写的一路的根本写的，还有绿的那个写的，一了天多的，绿的那个写的旅行的，绿的那个写的了，那绿的那个写的，一了天多的，意思说，绿的那个写的了，我绿的那个写的旅行的，旅行的一了天多的。Is the companies.
Then there's a subsequent, I'm not sure, I don't know the exact verse that this corresponds to, but in the commentary, there's a section which where the materialist is presented as then responding by saying that the position that's being represented as the Buddhist position seems to be at odds with actual word of the Buddha. There's some passages in canonical writings which suggest that the Buddha said that the body depends, that the mind depends on the body. So is this doctrine that you're asserting, you Dr. Kirti, asserting, or you Buddhist scholar is asserting, are you not in fact at odds with what the founder of the Buddhist tradition himself asserted? And so the point being that there is a passage that one can find in the scriptures in which the Buddha has said that is reported to have said that Ludang Sem Pension Jesuitiawa. Pension Jesuitiawa said that they are mutually affecting one another, and that's the actual wording that's identified. And so, does that not suggest that one half of that relation is that the mind depends on the body? So the Buddha said they both depend on each other. So at least in part, the Buddha is saying the Buddha did not say the mind depends on the body. And so then the commentary here is stating that the Srila Dharma Kirti's view is that the meaning of that statement, properly understood, is only that what the Buddha meant by that is only that sensory consciousness, the forms of consciousness that arise through the body, and those are the five sense consciousnesses, that those can have an effect, a beneficial effect on the mind. So if you have a pleasant physical experience, that can cause the mind to experience some kind of ease, for example. So in that sense, the body is Pandopa means to benefit, but it can have an effect, a favorable effect on the mind. And that's all that the Buddha meant. He was not talking about that the mind was derivative from the body.
这也是到底能是在一直做的吧，还是呢？什么习题呢？你就是自己在处理，什么习题呢？这样内容就是呢？你就是那个去不要的，这上头什么习题的呢？就是偏重于，第一个什么习题对呢？Jampa to us here, assembly ship to the back. All these are the same sample generals to get into that. But
so, in fact, the Buddhist view is while the Buddhists do acknowledge that the body can have an effect on the mind, both favorable and unfavorable. The more important Buddhist then attitude is that between the body and the mind has a much more powerful ability to influence the body, assuming that you are able to control your mind. That by controlling your mind in a positive way, that can affect your physical well-being. So favorable spiritual attitudes such as loving kindness and compassion, by their very nature, have a beneficial effect on the body. They can cause you to be much more at ease, physically at ease, than the reverse. By the same token, if you don't have control over your mind and you allow yourself to generate, harmful minds, or if you're depressed, even, that can become, strongly, that those kind of strong emotional states can have a harmful effect on your health.
Jasanta, Semdi Lili Dojiki, Dojiki Chavati, Sem like Gundochi, you get Gundochina, Lili Gundo Jotini. That's a year is Lili Dojiki Chavati. And in Lili, Semdi Dojiki Chavati, Lili Gundo to do some assembly Gundo to bring a fire. Or the industry, che se la superficie il campo la potenza sembra che tutto sia sempre completo per il mondo e arriva di cugneto su ci tutto il legge di tutto su il campo la c'è tutto ci pierde io ti mangi tu via ne sembia cugneto via but it just a community semi toji che c'è ma in carriera se ne viuli che do tutti lui yange che lui le cange c'è sembra cange sem carese yange che tu c'è va ne sem yange tu c'è va sem ti sem yange Vila never tuna, similar, never never, semi-young to my day young.
Yes, it's also semi.
Yeah, you were to because the name to Vila never wear. We want you to wear. Yes, then the argument to wear. People caress and beauty. To achieve each other. You need to achieve each other. Also, I need that currency. Also, really to go to talk to some
previously, I want to revise the way I translated something. I said that the body does not have the ability to put an end to the mind. That I was referring to the phrase dolce. Dolce literally means to reverse or to cause it to be turned back, literally. I think the meaning is not as extreme as meaning that the body is the governing factor for the very existence of the mind. Although, in fact, that is the materialist position. What is being discussed here, and but that phrase is more narrowly focusing on is which has a governing influence over the other in the relationship between the mind and the body. Is the body more? Does it have a greater element of control and influence over the mind, than the mind does out over the body. So the Buddhist position is the body does not have a controlling influence over the mind. Lobsang means this ability of being able to reverse it. So one way of reversing would be if you do something to harm the physical body, it would necessarily harm the mind. So then that's a Lobsang meaning some kind of reversing, some kind of cause that reverses the condition of the related element, mind or body. And then Chewajen means that it is, that it literally means extraordinary, an extraordinary reversing cause, if you want to take it literally. But the idea is that while each one has an influence over the other, the mind has more of a controlling influence over the body, and the mind is also able to be unaffected by the body in a way that is not true of the body. So the mind can very directly affect the body in a positive and a negative way. And while the body can also have an effect on the mind, that in certain instances, for example, those who are yogis and those who have control over their minds, those types of beings, even though the severity or the austerity of their lives can cause their outer appearance to seem to be weakened or diminished or emaciated physical bodies, for instance, that in no way is harming their minds. Their minds can be extremely developed and can be in a state of great well-being, mental well-being, which their body sort of belies. So, on the other hand, I kind of speaking of persons other than yogis and yoginis, is we are subject to very strong mental afflictions, desire and the like. That can impair our physical well-being. On the other hand, very strong virtuous states of mind, which are salutary, can also impart a sense of physical ease. And that's indicative of the more powerful influence that the mind has on the body than the body does on the mind. Okay, so with that, then you're free to ask a question. Sorry? No, that's okay. All right, okay.
I was thinking back to Pramanasiddhi's definition of what is a valid cognition,
Right.
of being new and non-deceptive,
Right.
and that Prasangika doesn't accept the new part of it.
Right.
But then I was thinking, like when I see a color blue, and then you ask me 5 minutes later, I'm not sure exactly whether it was as vivid or turquoise or what shade of blue I was looking at.
Okay.
So my memory is not reliable. So it seems like the first instant of cognition should be the accurate one, a non-deceptive.
Okay.
But why does Prasangika not accept the new part of
Oh,
definition?
okay, those are two different things, but that's fine. Dene Karasa, Sevenamdiri Lugla, and then Cheme Cheni Sardu Rupa Sayatila, and then Sardu Sendi Kotambo with the top or Gyumed Topati, Kotama Yuvati, and then Chindugi Jeshiti, Karasa, Tema Maniba. Kawachiyar is Septamelula. And a Hinduelula and the Digi he came at Kelly, but Jesha Korea, the Timanti, 차셔기래. 근데 뭐 계시디나 saya yang petisiga tengoati kasa cacing kurang itu soal sambil petisiga karena sosu ki kadoji thongsona kado thongdu kala to kado kani bati ki tak muasum tu cik thongbe yata kurang ti tak buat 내가 소리 자세하게 말해. 아니 비각들라 아니 보강 통한 난시 코라이 이바 대마이바 소리 딜라 그래서 그 디기 체제 소리 자세하게 말해. 딱히 가마 그시기 쇼가 이 뭔지 미시 디기 쇼가 가마나게 쇼가 아니 상담이 젠 투게 알아. 아니 나 가마나 냐야. 아니 가듯이 통발에 ini kok kata di tata nasi zaman nanti syarikat dosa ya jangan di kan mungkin ini bisa di kurang kalau ya tapi ini kurang moneter ini kok semua ini besar dosa dan zaman di syurga cuma di kayak sela masalah mangga solci di degi solci yang ada yang bisa ini tadi jadi di kurang di ya tak betul betul nanti tak terasa tak solusi, mengiba solusi. Sama sekali itu. Tapi dalam cerdas, itu solusi. Negara sama di cerdas ini.
Cita-cita tengah sangkir siapa, untuk ini satu jalan cina ini siapa, untuk ini satu jalan milulah. Orang jalan nasi jalan ni berhiasan. 아니 밀로아 제가 지금 정말 스타버가 밀로아를 다루게 되시다가 그래서 지난 시대 제시대 밀로아 지역에 사도자스비 사도지 자원이 미시 밀로아 지구 생산을 논의나 수입에 밀로아 지에서나 제시 라스 사도자녀들이 제시 정말 제베 제시 그다 미루어 창기 도시게 살도 참만 말이 있어요. 참만 많이 있다. 생담바에 그 미루어지 차례에서나 미루어서디 이 있는 지다와시 아 또 이상 그래도야 나시 그런 데가 이상 미루어시 어디에서 상계기 아니 상계기 재미있게 있어야지 유의되는 미루어 이상 근데 재미있게 있어요. 이제는 재미가 됐다. 이제는 미루가 있었죠. 오늘도 미리 터득 잡아라. 미루가 인간이 이 지다를 집어넣는 시도는 내가 있어. 그래서 미루가 있죠. 센터 같은 이니가 미루가 지켜내는 집에 미루가 캐치는 집에서 무슨 것이 시험이 지다와신 마도 생각을 봐. 제시 미루가 캐치는 거. 다살도디 다분히 때지야. 살도디가 이 가수의 살도디니야. 제바체만 써야지 두지다지 되는 것들 집에 또 제바체만 써야 되와. 제바에는 이런 제바체만 이 장에 제시는 또 왜 집에 뒤지대 되는 또 집에 당 무슨 그 장에 제시는 무슨 길이 세버리지 어려운가 뒤지도 많이 와. 이 장에 제시 제바들이 뒤지대 되는 기알 일이 잡아지고 제바의 장에 제시 일단 제바이 뒤지대 되는 또 집에 제바 아니지 다티 타니 집에 检验自己应该怎么做。
So, kind of the one thing that which I kind of pointed out about the way he raised the question that I think he wanted to maybe, what should I say, clear up for black people, right, is that when the, and I'm sort of interpreting what he said, when you said that the subsequent recollection of the perception doesn't seem to be as clear as the initial perception, and therefore that seems to suggest that the Yogacara kind of extra requirement that it be the initial perception in order for it to be cognition, and the subsequent recollection, the recognition of it, is not because it can be less clear or less vivid, as you put it. He said that's really not the distinction that the Yogacaras have made. They're not saying that the post perceptive recollection is somehow less correct. Both of them are milua, right? Milua means it's some there. So the idea of milua, being non-deceptive, is, to use the Tibetan word. The Sanskrit word is more like to not be in disagreement with what is purported to be the case, right? So if what the mind is perceiving corresponds to what is actually there, then that's what the idea of non-deceptive sort of means. And that can be true of the subsequent recollection as much as it is of the first instant of perception. So the way that you phrased that distinction really was sort of not exactly giving the difference between the Yogacara view versus the Pramanasiddhi, right? But I think one of the points that he made was that, right? Then the other point that he made was that the whole point of this chapter is that while we're talking about what correct cognition is in the general sense, right? And for Buddhists, there's two kinds: there's direct perception and there's inference. The ultimate subject, or the ultimate point that the chapter is trying to make, is that the Buddha has the qualities that are associated with correct cognition, but in a special way. In a special way that his enlightenment is such that everything that he expressed, everything that he taught about valid spiritual goals and the means of achieving those spiritual goals conforms exactly with the way he saw them and the way he experienced them and the way he in fact pursued them and achieved the result, his own personal experience. So in that sense, what he said about that subject matter is then non-deceptive in the same way that we consider ordinary, the general epistemological sense of correct cognition to be non-deceptive. So then he said, in that sense, when we're talking about the Buddha, that seems to be more an idea of what valid cognition means as the Pramanasiddhis purport it to be, which is non-deceptive in an unqualified sense. And that idea of being the initial, cognition of the object as being, required for it to be, correct cognition. That doesn't seem to apply to the way it's being used to describe Buddha as sort of the being who embodies, in the ultimate sense, correct cognition, right? So he made that point. And what else? Let's see. So the other thing was simply that idea of the chieshe, or that's another point. Okay. So he said also there are two kinds of correct cognition, direct perception, right, and inference, right. And so there, that the Sadhu Milua, that the Yogacara definition of what is correct cognition, equally applies to inference as it does to direct perception. So it's not only direct perception for the Yogacarans that is embodying that definition. Right? However, the nature of correct cognition that is direct perception versus the nature of cognition that is inference, correct inference, they're different. And one way to see the difference is in terms of that recollection or recognition of the moment of the first moment of cognition. So the first moment of direct perception is, in the case of direct perception, sensory perception or even yogic direct perception, is an aconceptual state of mind. Right? It is direct. It is unmediated by any kind of dualistic thought, right? Or any kind of concept. Then the recollection of it, that is, like you're saying, that you remember what you perceived, that kind of being the way of verifying what you actually perceived in an aconceptual experiential state. That, however, is conceptual. That recollection is reflective, and it perceives what you directly perceive sensorially, and perceives it via the mechanism of, mental imagery. Dönchi, that word dönchi means some kind of conceptual image of what it means to perceive blue. And so those two are different in that one is aconceptual, the other is conceptual. But in the case of inference, they're both conceptual. In inference, the first moment of perceiving inferentially something, as the Yogacarans claim, is the true, correct inferential knowledge, right? Is also via these conceptual images, not directly. And then the moment that follows it, where you reflect and you recall what you perceive through your inferential powers, that too is conceptual. So that distinction is something that needs to be noted. And that's, that the case of inference didn't really fit the example that you gave. Both of them were conceptual, and so it's giving you things to think about.
That is same number given nature to that Cheshi Pinchamama said, which is an financial start going to go together. In a package, just start to talk to Gyumed. He used that Chirag Shivanish. The given meditate start to Samas at Shabbat. Jeshi the Samati Toki Tosham Jiva. Samati Toki Tosham is an Senator Shinji. Never is the thing with the middle of the end to this. Is enough.
So, rather, continuing on the issue that you raised, the Swatantrika Madhyamaka school, which generally accepts the principles of the epistemological school of Gnana, they use that same quality of the original non-deceptive moment of cognition. But the distinction they make between that and the subsequent moment where you are aware, you're reflectively aware of what you perceive, the real distinction they made doesn't have to do with one being more clear than the other per se. The basis of that distinction is that they say that that recognition is not, it doesn't have the non-deceptive awareness of the object independently of the initial cognition. So it's only because the initial cognition occurred that it has also the same capacity to continue to have some awareness of that object. But on its own, it is kind of weaker. It's dependent on the first moment. So that seems to be the basis of the distinction. For the Prasangikas, there may be more to it metaphysically than that, but at any rate, that's one thing, one way to look at it. The second point is that for the Prasangikas, they don't make sense. It's non-deceptive, and that's good enough for it to rise to the level of correct cognition.
Small question. When you said that an arhat's mental continuum is extinguished,
Right.
and then somehow find consciousness.
There was okay. Yes, you.
So where would that consciousness?
Okay. I think maybe I didn't make the distinction clearly. The point was that there were. I'll give it to Rinpoche, but he didn't express it that way. Maybe it came through. Daging di ane kalsa, kalsa. Kya cimaki tujuki ripati la, ane ripati capat dan jawa cina, ane dene di kya cima tak ni kamewa la, ane kya cimaki kalsa. Samjar di ngeva desa sort of. Dene di dene kya suci yuru. Tapi jadana anda coba ina, kau capat dan jawa insan peran samjar. Yo hare ane merangi nge tutu kana Rinpoche gicik ya lubcik la ane jacoba di kalsa di junchewa cik lubcik sigara yang lubcik di junchege hare te ningsam jarke hare te yine Quran Ripati juni cik kigere sen di kaya sta moge di young to sort of got in. It was true. So the point was, if anything, I apologize for not giving it the distinction clearly. Certain Buddhist schools maintain that if you follow a Hinayana path to arhatship and then achieve arhatship, when you die, then your mental continuum ceases and does not continue to exist at all. So that kind of person, that arhat, would not have a future rebirth. So the argument for future rebirth excludes an arhat in that sense. And the only person that is indicated by the argument is the ordinary samsara person who's still subject to desire. When that person died, necessarily that type of mind will be followed by another moment of consciousness, which will be his rebirth or her rebirth in the next one. So it doesn't apply to arhats, but then there are two different positions. One position, the mind continuum is extinguished. In a different Buddhist point of view, the mind condition is not extinguished. It goes into a state of the extreme peace of Hinayana Nirvana, and the mind abides in that state. So it's not extinguished. But it's not reborn samsara like that. That was extinguished.
A second little question. Clarify this body-mind thing. If the body has a condition that physically prevents life from function, such as Alzheimer's, the tangles in the brain, or bipolar disease, genetic conditions that affect the mind, is that the same as saying the body affects the mind or the function of the mind? Is there a distinction?
When young person, Mikashe Alzheimer's, Jampa 부부장 아니 남기 밑에 저기 두두만한 하고 배워 말해. 아니 소소소리 그냥마 새끼 내수니 대마 투로 되게 다디 생기 나사서 찾아야 돼. 이게 거든요. 이 제를 바기세나 가르수기 어렸으면 레와나라 기ön소리 나사서 타네. 그 생기 그런 레가지 제도 유도 그것을 전제를 양 이마이 바양 미 개고 매나이네 셔바이네 로 아니 체면을 소리지라 저기 양 가서 샘 대화기 견드는 지와 미 가셔기 양 가서 견제네 가서 추시서 미 계속 세우는 시 너무 소리지 지금 비와 이양 그저 제를 보겠잖아 the little day step that get should as the job is not so it's not the job just the similar new years the similar the Sam Koran Nubiyoina, Sam Dilla Manovich, Sam Dilla Takasapot, Legi, Koran Legat, from the Nasameva to the some Tamatu, again, King Ambassador, Chicken Contest, Ambassador, then Dilla, Contest as
Numbers region to soon as thanking us. 내 스탠딩이 시작. 스탠딩에 가르쳐 뚝뚝 시작. 자당 무슨 띠 생명도 처리해. 무슨 내 스탠딩 메뉴나 비비가 이거 찾는 것이. 무슨 내 스탠딩. 먼저 너네 나도 내가 강강 내가 있다. 무슨 내 스탠딩에 있는 어때 내분에지 무슨 뜻이야? 무슨 차당 무슨 뭔지 나의 생각에 되어지야. 자산 생각하는 게는 개인의 있어. 이제 다 스티비네티 그래서는 차당 무슨 뭔지 아니 생각 이게 처리해라. 아니 생각에서는 이 차당
So, from Buddhist point of view, all illness is essentially comes from the mind. So the mind is the ultimate source of illness. For example, the three root mental places, so three poisons are the ultimate form of illness. And then in that sense, we all are subject to that impairment or that ailment, we'll call it that. And he quoted a verse of homage to the medicine Buddha. In the verse, it refers to the medicine Buddha as the one who heals all the diseases of three poisons. And so, from a Buddhist point of view, then the mind is its illness does not ultimately come only from the body, but rather what we should think of as all then impairments are ultimately due to either directly from our karma or directly from the way we think, and that the mind, just as flawed minds or unhealthy minds can produce illness. Similarly, virtuous and positive minds can produce well-being. So that's the way to think.